Initially, the fields appeared empty. In an instant, however, an overwhelming number of Indians, far more than I had ever imagined, appeared before the fort. This was the scene that Rachel Parker Plummer encountered on the morning she was captured during a Comanche raid. In a terrifying assault, her home was ravaged, and many of her family members lost their lives. It seemed as though hundreds of mounted warriors emerged from nowhere, striking without any warning. Today, we will explore the experience of enduring a Comanche raid. The Comanche were rightly feared for their reputation as one of the most ruthless and formidable tribes of the West. Their domain, known as Comancheria, encompassed the entire southern plains, a harsh landscape they had seized through force. As nomadic people, their expertise in horseback riding was crucial to their dominance and marked a significant development in their history, stemming from the introduction and subsequent escape of Spanish horses in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Comanche were unparalleled in their skills and became legendary as both warriors and raiders. By the late 1700s, they had successfully driven rivals such as the Apache from the plains and had only managed to establish tense treaties with the Spanish before Mexican independence. However, as the 1800s progressed, the westward expansion of American settlers led to inevitable confrontations with the Comanche. Manifest destiny dictated that the United States should conquer the entire continent from east to west. Yet the discovery of gold in California allowed early settlers to largely bypass Comancheria, leaving a significant portion of the Western Territory untouched for a time. The harsh conditions of the plains posed a significant threat to survival, but the local inhabitants were equally perilous. The allure of fertile land and prosperous farms attracted thousands of settlers. It was only a matter of time before the nearby Comanche took notice of these vulnerable newcomers. While some tribes could be persuaded, intimidated, or deceived, the Comanche were not inclined to engage in negotiations. Over the past 2 centuries, their culture had undergone relentless expansion through fierce warfare, and with each generation, this way of life became increasingly ingrained in their identity. As raiders, the Comanche excelled. A notable instance of their prowess can be seen in the encounter with the Spanish at San Saba, a century earlier. Deceived by the Apache, the Spanish established a mission in Presidio in the 1750s, believing the Apache's claims of wanting to be Christianized. However, it soon became evident that the Apache had ulterior motives. They insisted that the fort be constructed in what is now central Texas, within Comanche territory, having been engaged in a losing battle against the Comanche for decades. Their strategy was to incite conflict between two of their adversaries, and in March 1758, they succeeded with the arrival of spring grass. On the morning of the 16th, the soldiers at the Presidio awoke to the war cries of 2,000 mounted Comanche warriors surrounding their fortifications. Initially, the Comanche feigned peaceful intentions, but their true objectives were soon apparent. T.R. Feinbach, in his insightful work, Comanche, A History of a People, describes the scene as the Spanish peered over the walls. The savages were a breathtaking barbaric spectacle, Plains a mere Indian to the full panoply of war. The long lines of riders wore fantastic headdresses of plumes, deer antlers, and bison horns. Their faces were painted red and black, the color of death. Upon observing the fortifications, the Comanche shifted their focus from the Presidio to the priests stationed at the nearby mission. Outnumbered, the Spanish commanders could only watch in despair as the Comanche killed 8 individuals within the mission and set it ablaze while plundering its resources. Demonstrating their power, the Comanche lingered outside the Presidio for several days, slaughtering Spanish cattle before departing, having made their intentions clear. This marked the European encounter with the Comanche. In the 1800s, settlers aiming to establish their homes in this region faced a harsh reality. The threats were severe. One moment, they could feel secure within their dwellings. In the next, they could be confronted by a sudden attack. Accounts from settlers between the early 1800s and the 1870s illustrate the challenges of life on the frontier of Comancheria, where the Comanche were renowned for their exceptional raiding skills. Their tactics became well known, particularly when war parties were formed. These groups would often consist of small units, or in instances like the San Saba campaign, they could number in the hundreds. Their expertise in horsemanship allowed them to traverse vast distances in remarkably short periods, defying common expectations. Raiding typically followed a seasonal pattern, with spring being the prime time due to the lush grass that provided ample forage for their horses. Raids were characterized by their speed, aimed at acquiring supplies, valuables, and sometimes captives. However, the Comanche were cautious. They avoided leaving tracks that could be followed. Anticipating rain, they would delay their attacks, as muddy conditions would betray their movements. Stealth was paramount, and they preferred to operate under the cover of night. Other tribes, such as the Apache, held certain taboos regarding nighttime travel. Consequently, they would wait for the full moon to illuminate their path, facilitating both their approach and retreat. It did not take long for settlers to realize that when the grass was lush and the moon was bright, they were at risk. These circumstances are still occasionally referred to as the Comanche moon. As more settlements encroached upon Texas, conflicts became increasingly frequent. While records are scarce, some estimates indicate that in certain years, as many as 200 settlers may have lost their lives. Although this figure might be exaggerated, the actual number is undoubtedly higher than what has been documented. When settlers had the opportunity to appeal to politicians and military leaders regarding their plight, the issue became increasingly difficult to overlook. Nelson Lee, a cattle driver captured by the Comanche in 1855, recounted one of these raids. His group of 19 men was ambushed shortly after 1 a.m. To instill fear in those caught unprepared, the Comanche would yell and whoop as they charged into the camp, their faces often painted in a menacing black. Upon awakening to the chaos, Lee was swiftly lassoed and brought to the ground before being taken prisoner. In the darkness, he could only hear the cries of the victims, but by morning, he was able to describe the scene he encountered. He stated, "The scene was cold and heart-rending. They had cut and hacked the poor, cold bodies in the most brutal manner. Some had their arms and hands severed. Others were disemboweled, and still others had their tongues pulled out with sharp sticks thrust through them. All the deceased were scalped, and the fresh scalps hung from the belts of the savages." Efforts to retaliate against the Comanche often ended in disappointment. Accounts of men pursuing them across the high plains typically did not conclude favorably. The Comanche showcased their unique ingenuity when they captured a buffalo hunter. Herman Lehman, a white settler who had been adopted by the tribe during his childhood, recounted the incident. He described how the hunter was nearly paralyzed with fear and fell to his knees, pleading for his life. The chief ordered him to be stripped of his clothing and dressed in traditional Indian attire, securing a war bonnet on his head so tightly that he could not remove it. The Comanche then gestured for him to run back to his fellow white settlers. He comprehended their signals and took off, but when the white men spotted him approaching, they mistook him for an Indian and shot him multiple times. He collapsed before he could reach safety. A notable illustration of a Comanche raid is the infamous Parker IV massacre of 1836. This event gained notoriety for several reasons, which will be explored. The narrative will be presented through the perspective of one of the survivors, Rachel Parker Plummer. At the age of 17 in 1836, Rachel was described as attractive, with long red hair. She was married and already had a child, which was typical for that era. Rachel, her husband Luther, and several other families had relocated to Texas in the preceding years, seeking land and new opportunities. They were allocated a plot near the Navasota River in what is now Limestone County. This area was situated well beyond the reach of most white settlements, even on the frontier. Although it was recognized as a raiding territory for the Comanche, many local Native Americans had signed peace treaties with Texas, leading the settlers to believe that the presence of a fort would ensure their safety. Consequently, they constructed a large fort, spanning several acres and surrounded by 12-foot walls. It featured only two entrances, a large gate at the front and a smaller one at the back. Inside, there were multiple cabins and two blockhouses for observation, designed to serve as a strong defensive structure. The majority of the fort's residents were connected to the Parker family, while others lived on nearby farms and intended to seek refuge within the fort's walls. Situated far from the high plains, they were unprepared for the events that would unfold in May of 1836. Without any prior indication, the Comanche moved swiftly and stealthily under the light of the full moon. On the morning of the 19th, they traversed the territory and reached the Parker homestead. For the inhabitants, that morning began like any other. Before 9 a.m., several men, including Rachel's father, husband, and brother, ventured out to work in the fields. The atmosphere was warm and tranquil. Meanwhile, Rachel attended to her household tasks and played with her 18-month-old child. However, around 10 a.m., a cry from the fields pierced the calm. Indians. Rachel hurried to the blockhouse and peered over the fort's walls. In her memoirs, she recounted her observations. One moment, the fields were empty, and the next, an overwhelming number of Indians appeared before the fort. Before the settlers could comprehend the situation, hundreds of mounted Comanche warriors emerged just a few hundred yards from their defenses. A sense of dread filled the air, as many feared they were facing a war party. Then the settlers noticed an unusual action from the Comanche. They raised a white flag. Inside the fort, Rachel's uncles, Benjamin and Silas Parker, attempted to coordinate a response, but their discussions devolved into disagreements over whether to flee, conceal themselves, or engage in combat. Silas, at 32 years old, had gray hair that suggested he was neither young nor impulsive. He advocated for a defensive stance from behind the fort's walls. In contrast, Benjamin, who was 16 years his senior, understood that the fortifications were insufficient to withstand an onslaught from a determined group of Comanche warriors. He believed that survival would require the inhabitants to escape and find hiding places. As their debate continued, two Comanche warriors approached the fort ahead of the others. A signal was given, indicating a desire for conversation. Benjamin resolved to approach them, intending to allow the individuals inside time to prepare for their escape. Silas urged him not to proceed, but Benjamin was resolute. He passed through the front gate, while Rachel observed her uncle as he ventured out to engage with the Comanche alone. As Benjamin conversed with them, a Comanche from the rear began to draw closer. They inquired about potential camping locations and sources of water. Additionally, the Comanche requested one of the Parker's cattle for sustenance. Benjamin understood that this was not their true objective. The Comanche were well aware of where to find water, and the Navasota River was familiar territory for them. One account even indicated that some of their horses were still damp from a recent crossing. However, if Benjamin declined their request, they might attack him on the spot. He needed to buy the people inside as much time as possible to flee. Therefore, he stated that he wished to consult with his group before making any commitments to the Comanche. To his surprise, he was allowed to return to the fort. Benjamin informed everyone inside that he doubted the Comanche's intentions were peaceful and insisted that the women and children must leave immediately. He intended to go back outside to negotiate further with the Comanche to gain additional time for the others. Yet Silas seized him, warning that if he returned, the Comanche would likely kill him. Nevertheless, Benjamin believed this was the only way to delay the Comanche's advance on the fort for a few more moments. Before he departed again, Rachel recalled him, instructing the men inside to prepare for defense. Silas then turned to Rachel, expressing his certainty that Benjamin would be killed, and urged her to run to his cabin. It was located within the fort, where she could retrieve his shot pouch, as he already had his rifle. As Rachel glanced over the fort's edge, she saw Benjamin cautiously approaching the Comanche once more. This time, the situation was markedly different. The warriors swiftly began to encircle him. She hurried to retrieve the shot pouch for her uncle. Before she attempted to flee through the back of the fort, Silas assured her that he would take some of the Comanche with him. Clutching her infant son, she dashed toward the small gate at the rear of the fort. As she exited, the anguished cries of Benjamin reached her ears. The massacre had commenced. Gunfire and screams echoed in the air as Rachel fled from the fort, her 18-month-old son in her arms. It felt as though the Comanche were pursuing her relentlessly. Others were escaping alongside her, but she felt sluggish and cumbersome in comparison. For the Comanche, capturing her was merely a sport. Before she could cover a few hundred yards, she was knocked to the ground. The others who had escaped the fort continued their flight into the woods. Rachel attempted to shield her son, but the Comanche wrenched him from her grasp. As she struggled to resist, she heard more gunfire. Uncertain of its origin, she wondered if help was on the way. Had the neighbors come to repel the raiders? In a matter of moments, her hope dwindled and the gunfire ceased. It was coming from within the fort. The last defenders of the fort had been overpowered. Rachel was knocked down once more. A warrior seized her by her long red hair and dragged her back to the fort. When the Comanche warrior finally released Rachel, she fell beside Benjamin's lifeless body. He had been horrifically mutilated, his body riddled with arrows. As each Comanche passed by, they continued to thrust their spears into his remains. Rachel was compelled to remain beside him, her own blood staining her. In a state of panic, she searched for her son, and eventually she heard his cries. He was on a horse, held captive by two Comanche women. Rachel attempted to rush towards him, but was swiftly seized by two warriors. They beat and whipped her until her cries ceased. The Comanche then brought forth their other captives. Among them were three individuals, including a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. The Comanche escorting them from the fort were brandishing scalps, and Rachel observed that one of them was gray. She recognized it as belonging to Silas. Years later, she would discover that he had honored his promise by taking down 4 Comanche before they reached him. The identities of the other scalps remained unknown to her. As the captives looked on, the Comanche ransacked the fort, destroying everything deemed unnecessary and slaughtering all cattle they chose not to take with them. Soon the captives were compelled to begin their march towards the high plains, leaving behind the ravaged fort and their former lives. The Parker Fort Massacre is likely the most renowned Comanche raid, ranking alongside the Great Raid of 1840 and the San Saba Massacre. I pondered extensively about how deeply to delve into this narrative. At the time of the raid, there were 34 settlers present at the fort. Surprisingly, only 5 were killed during the attack, although one woman sustained injuries from an arrow to her breast. Additionally, 5 individuals were taken captive, including Rachel, her son, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a name that may be familiar to you. Remarkably, 23 individuals, approximately 2/3, managed to escape. This outcome was relatively common in raids. The primary objective was rarely to kill. Instead, the focus was on acquiring resources, although sometimes individuals themselves were considered resources. Once the initial threat was established, the Comanche typically shifted their focus to looting, which aligns with the events that transpired at San Saba. They could have inflicted significantly more harm, but they chose not to. Their message was conveyed, and they obtained what they sought without incurring substantial casualties on their side. Raiders typically favored softer targets, while Native Americans regarded losses with great seriousness. Replenishing warriors in small populations is a lengthy process. For this video, my intention was to concentrate on the raid itself. However, the experiences of the survivors, as well as Rachel's story, are compelling in their own right. Rachel would become a captive of the Comanche for nearly 2 years, and I hesitate to recount her entire narrative. While it is both captivating and tragic, it is also quite graphic, and I find it hard to believe that YouTube would deem it suitable for their platform. Rachel's personal account is likely the most reliable source, but there are several quality retellings available, including S.C. Gwynn's Empire of the Summer Moon and J.W. Wilbarger's Indian Depredations in Texas. Here is a PG-13 summary. Shortly after her capture, Rachel was separated from her son and other captives, such as Cynthia Ann. She endured constant beatings and harsh labor, and to make matters worse, she was pregnant with her second child at the time of her abduction. Although she gave birth to the child, it was soon killed due to interference from caring for it during her labor. This account is among the most shocking and gruesome I have ever encountered, yet she was compelled to persevere. Ultimately, she gained a measure of respect within the tribe after winning a fight following her mistreatment. The Comanche possess a unique perspective, particularly in their strong appreciation for bravery. After approximately 2 years, she is sold to a trader among the Comanche, leading to her eventual reunion with her family. During her brief return, she documented her experiences on 2 occasions. However, she passed away in 1939, likely due to complications following the birth of her 3rd child. If there is interest in hearing her full story, I will make arrangements to share it. Please express your interest in the comments. Regarding the legacy of Comanche raids, it is important to note that this incident was not an isolated event. Many individuals endured similar experiences, but the Parker raid stands out for another reason. One of the captives, a 9-year-old named Cynthia Ann Parker, was raised as a Comanche. She later married Chief Peter Nakona, and together they had a son, Quanah Parker, who became the last war chief of the Comanche. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to check out my other presentation on the 1871 Battle of Blanco Canyon. If you believe the settlers faced significant challenges due to Comanche raids, wait until you learn about the military's experiences.